Welcome to Project Combat. It's been a while. I'm excited to see lots of conversation among players and Jagex about improving combat. We've seen some good quality of life improvements the past few months, even fixing some issues I mentioned in episode 1. But for RuneScape to grow and retain new players, we need to address the fundamentally flawed combat systems. Each episode of Project Combat will focus on a fundamental system, outline issues, and propose realistic solutions that improve the player experience for everyone. Episode 3 explores accuracy and its related systems, so things like hit chance and the combat triangle. RuneScape uses a roll-to-hit accuracy system. Every time you attack, the game looks at your hit chance, which is calculated out from your accuracy and your target's armor. Your hit chance is the random % chance that your attack will actually do anything. The roll-to-hit system is dated, flawed, and feels bad for everyone. Players hitting random zeros just isn't fun. This is especially noticeable if your hit chance is really high, but you randomly miss an important ability. Even Jagex developers struggle with this system. They can't give a new boss really high defense because players will complain that it's not a fun encounter. The current accuracy system and its implementation of the combat triangle don't meet the initial goals laid out when EOC was designed 10 years ago. Let's go over the problems with the current accuracy system in detail. First, we'll talk about the affinity system. It's kind of unclear. So what even are affinities? Your hit chance is calculated by comparing your accuracy stat to your target's armor stat. Affinities are hidden numbers on every target that act like a percentage modifier to your actual accuracy. So if your accuracy stat is about 1,000, hitting a target with an affinity value of 50 results in you having effectively 500 accuracy, which is then rolled against your target's armor. That means that the accuracy number you see on your stat screen is always cut by some percentage. In every case, you're penalized. You're just not penalized as much if you attack with the correct style. But none of this is ever explained, and the user interfaces that support combat straight up give false information about affinities. This loadout interface mentions style bonuses, but the tooltip gives false information saying style bonus here increases how much damage you deal. Actually, style bonus refers to your defensive affinities. It has nothing to do with damage, and this has been a false tooltip for a decade. The affinity system was designed to support the combat triangle, which actually boils down to just rock, paper, scissors. There's no gameplay behind it. It's just an objective numbers disadvantage, or a punishment for not playing the game a certain way. Even worse, a target's affinities are actually misleading. Most targets have a visible weakness, but this only displays their 90 affinity weakness, and combat style weakness is implied. But some targets, like the giant mole, have no displayed weakness, but they do have varying affinity values. In-game, because the giant mole has no displayed weakness, players might reasonably assume that all combat styles are equally effective. But the giant mole actually has affinity values of 65 for magic, 55 for melee, and 45 for range. Because of this, magic is about 20% more accurate than ranged on the giant mole, but there's no way for new players to know this intuitively. This is a good example of how the affinity system is unclear and just doesn't support a fun player experience. Style affinities, which are used to enforce the combat triangle, punish players for using the wrong style. If a new player really loves ranged, and they choose to take on the giant mole, they're punished for it by having much lower hit chance than someone using magic. But this is negative reinforcement, which is pretty bad design. We're punishing players for their choices in what is supposed to be a sandbox MMORPG, and that feels pretty bad. Affinities limit a player's potential by reducing the stats provided by their gear. A player should be allowed to use their favorite style to its full potential wherever they want. We can still reward players for using different combat styles, but there's healthier designs to achieve this. With enough bonuses, the combat triangle, and affinities, and weaknesses mean almost nothing. Endgame players have so many accuracy boosts, like overloads and curses, that push them way above 100% hit chance on most targets, regardless of their style affinities. so players who have these tools can run through most PvM encounters with whatever style they want. The entire weakness system is mostly ignored by endgame players because there's no value to exploiting weaknesses beyond hit chance. The biggest flaw with the accuracy system is that having a hit chance below 100% feels really bad. Even if you're sitting at 99% hit chance, an unlucky miss on an important ability feels awful and can even scuff a boss run. For encounters like Telos, where reliable burst is crucial to maintaining streaks, players won't even attempt the boss unless they have an aura running, which pushes their hit chance up to 100%. Jagex actually recognizes that hitting zeros feels bad, so newer bosses have lower defense, but this design approach invalidates an entire combat system. It's not sustainable to continue introducing bosses whose defense means nothing so players can easily reach 100% hit chance. This also affects the reward space for higher accuracy weapons. Because the majority of bosses are easy to cap hit chance on, there's nothing exciting about a new weapon with higher accuracy. It doesn't add anything to the game or to the player. The original objectives of the accuracy system designed for EOC are not being met. We need to change the fundamentals behind accuracy to better serve players and developers. Project Combat is about reframing the conversation around fundamental systems. We have to first define what a good accuracy system looks like. Here are some key objectives for a healthy accuracy system in RuneScape. First, players should feel a sense of progression when increasing their accuracy through gear upgrades and other unlocks. This is done reasonably well right now. Any new system should fully retain or increase the progression experience for players as they get stronger. The system shouldn't feel much different for players who already have max accuracy. Developers should have design space to introduce high defense bosses without worrying players will hate it. Ignoring the combat triangle shouldn't feel punishing. We want players to have fun with their favorite styles and not feel forced to use a specific style. Engaging with weaknesses and the combat triangle should feel meaningful and rewarding for all players. We want to reward diverse players at all stages of the game. 100% hit chance shouldn't feel like a requirement to engage in content. Most importantly, any new system proposal shouldn't have too many possible ripple effects or content changes, although combat is complex and this can be tough to meet. We want to propose realistic solutions that don't break the game. I'm going to go through a design proposal that tries to meet these objectives. As always, this is a high-level proposal. Don't get hung up on a number balancing or a nuance. A well-designed system introduces levers of balance for developers to keep things in check. This is also just one of many possible solutions. This proposal can be used as a foundation for discussion around a better accuracy system. I'm proposing 3 simple high-level changes. First, we change hit chance to be a final damage multiplier. Next, we remove style-specific affinities and set a single neutral affinity value on everything. Lastly, exploiting a combat triangle weakness grants a small damage boost, which is further increased if exploiting a style-specific weakness. This proposal is pretty straightforward, and hopefully non-controversial. Let's get into the details of each change. First, changing hit chance to a final damage multiplier. Instead of a chance to hit zeros, a final damage multiplier reduces a player's damage output on a target. Final damage multiplier would be calculated exactly like how hit chance is calculated. This minimizes system disruption. For example, if a player has 50% hit chance right now on a target, the new system would instead multiply their final damage by 0.5, effectively cutting it in half. Mathematically, this has the same effect on DPS as a 50% chance to miss, but it feels much better for players because they're not hitting random zeros. All existing accuracy buffs like auras and stat boosts would affect a player's damage in the same way they do now. The DPS modifier would just be in the form of damage reduction rather than occasional zeros. This would also improve developer design space for endgame bossing. Jagex can now introduce a boss with really high defense and it wouldn't feel awful for players. The overall damage output of a player, even under effects like Berserk, should be about the same, although this change does have some outliers. We'll go over the specifics and implications later on. Next, style-specific affinities are removed entirely. This means a target won't have varying affinity values for different combat styles. A player's accuracy would no longer be reduced based on their chosen combat style. All targets in the game would have their affinity set to their neutral value. For example, the giant mole would have 55 affinity. This would mean no change on the affinity values for most endgame bosses. Affinities were originally meant to give each combat style clear use cases, but once players have sufficient accuracy, they're ignored. They mostly serve to punish the early to mid-game player for using the wrong combat style. And because style affinities aren't meeting their intended goals, we just don't need them anymore. We retain the single affinity value to minimize system disruption, and this allows Jagex to easily control player hit chance by modifying a target's affinity as needed. The combat triangle is still an important part of RuneScape's identity though. Players should be rewarded for exploiting weaknesses, just in a healthy way. To serve this, exploiting a target's combat style weakness would grant a flat 5% crit chance. Targeting a specific weakness grants 10% flat crit chance. For example, Water Fiends have a crossbow weakness. If you choose to use ranged against a Water Fiend, you'd benefit from plus 5% crit chance. Crossbows would increase your crit chance to plus 10. This reinforces the combat triangle in a healthy way. We reward players with greater than usual power if they choose to target a weakness, but a player who uses their favorite style is not punished or limited. The bonus doesn't have to be crit chance, it could be a small damage boost for example. Ideally we hit a sweet spot that rewards players who exploit weaknesses, but without making it feel necessary. For endgame players who normally ignore weaknesses, there's now meaningful value in exploiting them. PVMers can diversify their loadouts to take advantage of weaknesses, but again, it shouldn't feel necessary, just a nice little bonus. These three proposed changes should overall not feel very different to what we have now, but they vastly improve the early to mid-game experience and clean up the accuracy system for endgame players. Because RuneScape is a large game with overlapping systems, we have to go over the major impacts of these changes. The first major thing to note is that this is a slight buff to every player in the game. In cases where the player hits the damage cap often and doesn't have 100% accuracy, this would be a slight increase in overall damage as they're less likely to hit the damage cap in this new system. With that said, if someone is hitting damage cap consistently, they probably have close to 100% accuracy anyways, so the concern here isn't too great. The damage cap is also its own separate issue that we'll go over in another episode. This could also be a slight buff for cases where random effects are dependent on dealing damage, like Cinderbanes, although a simple solution would be applying the final damage multiplier to on-hit effects like Poison. It's also possible to rebalance certain bosses by modifying their defenses if an encounter becomes too easy. Another concern you might have is, what about debuffs like Vulnerability and Smoke Cloud? They shouldn't be accessible by any style without a cost. Because players in this system would never miss, it'd be too easy for any style to apply powerful, combat-specific debuffs that are locked behind accuracy requirements. To address this, your final damage multiplier would also apply to the duration of these debuffs. For example, if your accuracy is 90%, that means you have a 0.9 final damage multiplier. If you try to cast Smoke Cloud with 90% accuracy, the duration would be multiplied by 0.9, resulting in a 108 second debuff rather than 120 seconds. That means if you try to cast Smoke Cloud while wearing full range gear, your accuracy will be pretty low, meaning the final damage multiplier would make Smoke Cloud not last very long. This might require some tweaking or possibly hard caps where certain low accuracy causes the debuff to outright fail. We don't want to make it optimal to cast an off-style debuff without either a full gear switch or using Ingenuity of the Humans. This would include debuffs from abilities like Quake, Pulverize, and Binding Shot. Mathematically, reducing the duration of a debuff has about the same effect as a random chance to fail to apply it. Concern number 3, Ingenuity of the Humans. Its identity right now is mostly in landing off-style debuffs or special attacks, like the Siren Godbow. This functionality would actually be unchanged in the new accuracy system. Ingenuity of the Humans in the new system would guarantee a final damage multiplier of 1 on your next spell or ability. That means if you use Smoke Cloud after Ingenuity of the Humans, it would apply its full duration, and a special attack like Siren Godbow wouldn't suffer from damage reduction penalties. I'm not a fan of Ingenuity of the Humans, but I don't want to disrupt existing tools with this proposal unnecessarily. Another concern is affinity debuffs. What happens to them? In the new system, they'd have the same relative effect. Each stack increases a player's hit chance on a target, but that would now affect their final damage multiplier. Mathematically, applying an affinity debuff in this proposed system would have the same effect on your DPS as it does in-game right now. But they won't feel as mandatory because you're no longer risking random misses if you don't apply them. Just like hit chance can't go beyond 100%, your final damage multiplier wouldn't go above 1. But if you overcap on accuracy, items like Reaver's Ring still come into play. What about accuracy auras? Again, they'd function exactly like they do now. They increase your accuracy, which would improve your final damage multiplier. But auras would no longer feel absolutely necessary because stray zeros wouldn't be an issue. They'd still provide a notable power boost though, especially on high defense targets. So we're maintaining the relevancy of Aura and Viswax because they increase your damage the same way they do now. They just don't feel necessary. A really important question is, how does this new system affect incoming damage? Would players no longer take zeros and instead just have damage reduction across the board? This is actually debatable. Incoming damage is a completely different topic than outgoing damage in the context of PVM. The way incoming damage is calculated should not change at all with this proposed system. Even though it feels bad to occasionally hit zeros on a target, it's actually more satisfying to occasionally totally block incoming damage because of your gear. A 20% chance to totally block damage feels a lot better than 20% damage reduction, because each of those individual blocks have a lot more impact. We can also maintain combat style affinity for incoming damage, so that ranged armor can still work better for incoming magic damage. This way, we retain all of the current armor metas and defensive properties of existing gear, so gear loadouts don't change. If you're wondering about PvP, hit chances would work exactly like they do now. That's because PvP damage is incoming damage for at least one player. So this proposal would not have any effect on existing PvP experiences. The discussion around armor, defense, and tank playstyles is complex and deserves its own episode. Let's summarize this proposal. So first, we remove style affinities for NPCs entirely. We set all target affinities to their current neutral affinity. Number 2, players who exploit a target's combat weakness are granted a 5% crit chance buff. Exploiting a specific weakness, like fire spells, would grant 10% crit chance. Number 3, hit chance calculation is changed to a final damage multiplier calculation. That means a 95% hit chance in the current system would act as a 0.95 multiplier that factors in at the very end of damage calculation. The final damage multiplier would cap out at 1. Most importantly, most existing accuracy affecting systems would remain unchanged, as they'd still affect DPS the same way they do now. These proposed changes would have a much higher impact on the early to mid-game player experience. Existing accuracy modifiers would work just like they do now, so anyone who currently has 100% hit chance on most of their targets won't notice much has changed. But early to mid-game players who pick a favorite combat style are no longer being punished when they run into certain encounters. Also, everyone who exploits weaknesses is rewarded for it. For endgame bosses, players would no longer feel insufficient with under 100% hit chance, but the value of things like overloads, prayers, auras, and affinity debuffs, which can take players up to 100% hit chance, are all retained as they still buff your DPS in the same way. Jagex has recently teased a potential new accuracy system and acknowledged that roll to hit just isn't working for us, so I hope this proposal resonates with the community. RuneScape's combat system has so much potential, but we need to address the long-standing fundamental issues that affect both players and developers. I'm going to continue this project as a source for design-based discussions. You can be a part of Project Combat's future episodes by joining our Discord server found in the description below. Next episode, we will cover a very hot topic: Switchscape and Combat Mastery. What does it mean to be good at RuneScape combat? And how do switches fit into Combat Mastery? Thanks so much for watching.